This is a Micro Swiss CR10 hot end, but the eagle-eyed of you may be able to notice right away that this is not a genuine Micro Swiss hot end. It is in fact a clone. But here's the thing. It's actually a very good clone. In fact, it may even be better than the real deal. Where there is a good idea, there is a Chinese manufacturer waiting to clone that idea and sell it back to the general public at a fraction of the cost of what the original manufacturer has it listed for. And this is absolutely no different. This one comes from a manufacturer called Mello, and they're found on AliExpress. Now, typically, people look at Chinese clones as cheap knockoffs. But in this case, we've found something that is a bit perplexing, because this isn't a cheap knockoff. In fact, it's an improvement over the original design. And that is interesting. How could Microswiss, an American manufacturer, fall behind a Chinese knockoff in terms of quality or progress? Well, the answer, unfortunately, is complacency. Microswiss is very content with manufacturing the things that they currently make, as they do sell well. They've already got the tooling to manufacture it and don't really feel like they need to change anything about what it is they have designed. The Chinese market has listened to the requests and demands of the 3D printing consumer and have thus improved upon an already nearly perfect concept. It's hard to really even know where to start with all of this, because on Chinese market websites like AliExpress, there are so many different variations of this design that it really should have Microswiss concerned. Now, I have talked to Microswiss about a few of the features that I have seen on the Chinese markets that I think are worth paying attention to, but alas, I've been told that Microswiss either does not have the capacity to do certain things or simply prefer to keep doing what they're doing in order to maintain a certain level of compatibility with extras that they have designed, such as their direct drive system for hot ends like this. So let's dig into the various components that we see before us and talk about those variations that the Chinese manufacturers have come up with, and why I think Microswiss needs to start taking this as a serious threat to their business. In order to maintain simplicity, we'll be working our way from the top of the hot end down to the bottom. The first thing we'll talk about is the heatsink, and the eagle-eyed among you will notice immediately a few things that are different about this heatsink compared to the stock one that comes directly from the genuine article, Microswiss. First, you'll notice that there's no countersinking on these two holes where you would put your bolt that screws this heatsink into the X-axis gantry. Typically, the bolt is rounded, not flat, so there could be some issues in terms of final placement once tightening down this heatsink to the X-axis gantry because of that. However, you could always just use flat-headed bolts instead of the round heads if that really is a problem for you. Next, you'll notice there are two holes beside the center hole. If you're familiar with a standard Mark 8 heatsink, you'll know that they often come with two bolts that go from the underside of the heat block and screw into the heat sink, and this helps maintain an extra amount of rigidity. However, it's completely up for debate as to whether or not that should even be done, as it may transfer excess heat from the heat block to the heat sink unnecessarily. But one thing we simply can't ignore is the most common complaint that I see about Micro Swiss CR10 heatsinks. It uses a Bowden collect instead of a pneumatic coupler. A lot of people report that their Bowden tubes slip up and down inside of the heatsink because a Bowden collect does not grip a Bowden tube hard enough. Now, there are manufacturers out there on AliExpress that have simply pre-tapped some threads into this exact same heatsink, which allow you to screw in a pneumatic coupler in its place. Micro Swiss has told me they have no plans on doing such a thing because they want to continue using the Bowden collect as it is intentional. The low-profile design allows Micro Swiss to continue ensuring compatibility with this heatsink and other various products from Micro Swiss, such as their direct drive system. So, if you are not a fan of Bowden collects, you can get this exact heatsink that'll work with Micro Swiss components that use pneumatic couplers instead of a Bowden collect. That's one area I think Micro Swiss might need to look into. Other competitors have noted this common issue and have made solutions. But Micro Swiss says that would create too many unnecessary variations. So, for their purposes, they're perfectly fine and content with manufacturing what they already manufacture. Moving on from there, we have TC4 versus Grade 5 titanium heat brakes. They are the same metal, it's just they are graded differently in China compared to the United States, and just like the genuine thing, it bottoms out inside of the heatsink at a predetermined location and is held tightly in place by a grub screw. Things begin to get very interesting the moment we start talking about the Mark 8 heat block. Now, to be fair, it's not like Micro Swiss designed the Mark 8 heat block. It's relatively universal. As long as your heat brake screws into these threads and your nozzle does the same, it'll fit on just about anything. And credit to where credit is due, Micro Swiss uses the proper grade of aluminum for this application, one that blends strength as well as heat conduction, which is exactly what you'd want in this application. But where they fall short is customization and compatibility with aftermarket modification. To an extent, this is something that they could rectify very easily. Let's talk about these holes. Now, this big one right here is for your heater cartridge. Micro Swiss does have a design that utilizes 2 bolts on the bottom that screw into the top portion of the heat block, and it clamps down on the heater cartridge, which is indeed a better design to prevent the heater cartridge from slipping out. But let's get into some other areas where I think they could improve on. Now, you'll see the smallest hole right up on top is indeed for your standard glass bead thermistor. And this right here is a bolt that screws into the block to retain that glass bead thermistor. If you don't like glass bead thermistors, you can always take that bolt out and use a hex bolt type thermistor that screws into where this retaining bolt would go. But where Micro Swiss falls short is this last hole down here. E3D and their V6 J-head style heat blocks utilize a cartridge type thermistor or a PT100 thermocouple. Either of those require this size diameter hole. Now, if you ever planned on heating up your heat block past 300 degrees Celsius, you would need a PT100 thermocouple or a PT1000 because your standard thermistors just simply don't read above 300 degrees Celsius accurately, and that's where this hole comes into play. But if you're also going to heat up to that temperature, aluminum may no longer be a viable solution. Aluminum will start to degrade at a certain temperature, which is where Chinese manufacturers have yet again beaten Micro Swiss to the punch on a solution. You can get this exact block made in copper. And it's just not bare copper either. It's nickel-plated copper. It's not going to have any degradation due to heat, at least not until you get past 500 degrees Celsius. They also make Mark 8 nozzles that are copper and nickel-plated to accompany that. Now, this is something that E3D does. They make copper J-head heat blocks and nickel-plated copper nozzles for when you want to go to the extreme in terms of temperature. That's also why their heat blocks support PT100 thermocouples. But Micro Swiss doesn't have these as available features. And yet you can go on AliExpress, and from the same manufacturer that makes all these components, Mello, you can get a copper nickel-plated heat block in a Mark 8 style that has all the available options for measuring temperature, and have a nozzle to go with it that is capable of going over 500 degrees Celsius. I did talk to them, and they said that they have in fact been contemplating a design for high heat applications. Because once you start printing in materials like PEEK or PEI, you really do have to go really high in temperature. The last thing we'll talk about is the nozzle, and we're going to be focusing specifically on Mark 8 nozzles because that's what's used in this particular kit that replaces the hot end on the CR10 or the Ender 3. Now, here's the thing. Micro Swiss provides either a plated copper nozzle or a plated hardened steel nozzle. Now, they are both good nozzles. They are rather expensive, but they're machined exceptionally well. And they're coated with something special to reduce the friction on the inside of the nozzle, and that allows for a more smooth flow of molten plastic. But Micro Swiss does offer M2 hardened steel nozzles for other hot end kits that they make. Not the Mark 8, but other ones. And I think that's a bummer because in terms of wear resistance, M2 hardened steel is, well, it's going to last the longest out of those three options. So, Mello decided that they would take the opportunity to manufacture an M2 hardened steel nozzle that fits on the Mark 8. And here's the thing. It is machined exceptionally well. I don't know just how good I can get the focus from my camera onto this nozzle without some sort of macro lens, but I can assure you that it is a very nicely machined nozzle, and it is one that I think Micro Swiss should be afraid of. This is not the same as a knockoff of a Ruby nozzle because, well, Ruby nozzles have their own problems. This is a well-known material, and it's nothing even particularly exotic, but it's offered in a style that is used on one of the most common hot ends in the world. And yet Micro Swiss doesn't offer this option. And if they did offer this as an option, I would almost most certainly choose the Micro Swiss over the Mello, because Micro Swiss has that special coating that reduces friction. On a metal like this, friction does become a concern, especially with materials like PLA that can be rather sticky. So where does that leave us exactly? Well, I'll tell you this much. it leaves me scratching my head. There's a clear market for American-made, high-quality components that are machined well and work well for this market. 3D printing is huge, and it's only getting bigger. Microswiss has on their hands a very, very competent design. But it's becoming clear that either through complacency or through the sheer lack of ability to produce such things, whether it be from lack of resources or perhaps lack of time, lack of manpower, etc., they are falling behind their Chinese competition. And they are falling behind incredibly fast. The Chinese manufacturing market is massive. There's no denying that. Microswiss, if you see this, this is what you're competing against. You're competing against companies that have the manufacturing capability to deliver what people have been asking of you for a very long time now. There was certainly a time when Chinese knockoffs were seen as inferior copycats, but we have now gone to a place where the Chinese copycats have surpassed the design that they were copying. They've improved upon it. The student has become the master, and that should concern Microswiss greatly.